Hello and welcome to the Chicago Humanities Festival. I'm Philip Bahar, the executive director of the festival, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Walter Isaacson on Jennifer Doudna. Tonight's conversations are annual Richard J. Franke program, recognizing the remarkable contributions of our founder and chairman emeritus, Rich Franke. We so appreciate all that Rich has done for the festival over the past 30 plus years, and certainly thank him for his ongoing support. Tonight's program is also presented in partnership with our media partner, WBEZ. This is one of our first programs of 2021, and we so hope that you'll join us for more throughout the coming months and the coming year. If you want to check out our schedule of events, please visit chicagohumanities.org. And if you'd like to become a member or make a contribution to support our efforts, please do so there. All of our digital programs have closed captioning, which you can control through YouTube. And with that, please welcome WBEZ's Chief Content Officer, Steve Edwards, and Walter Isaacson.
Philip, thank you so much for that introduction. And Walter, thank you so much for being here. I wish we could do this in person, but it's great to be able to do it virtually.
I look forward to being back in Chicago. I'll probably be back in May. So next time we do something in person.
Well, congratulations on this remarkable book, The Code Breaker. And, there's so much to get into. This is a book that is about human discovery. It's about the scientific process. It's about really what it means to be fully human. But I thought it would be appropriate for us to begin the conversation tonight as we sit here on the 1-year anniversary to the day when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic, and at a time when now some of us perhaps have received a first, if not a second shot of the vaccine, and others are awaiting their opportunity to get vaccinated, to actually begin with the vaccine, the COVID vaccines, the Pfizer Moderna vaccines, because they relate directly to the story you tell in The Code Breaker. For those who may not be aware, help us understand how the Code Breaker connects to the vaccines that we're all in the process of getting or awaiting right now.
Well, it's amazing. And tonight, President Biden's going to announce that May 1st, they'll be available to anybody in the country because these vaccines are a total miracle. And they're done, we're talking about the Pfizer BioNTech one and the Moderna one, in a way that's different from every other vaccine that's been done before. It used to be you took an inactivated version of the virus, and that was the way you did a vaccine. But these use RNA, the sort of not very famous cousin to DNA, but you program the RNA to make a fragment of that famous spike protein of the coronavirus. And the RNA goes into our cells and tells the manufacturing region of our cells, make some versions of this spike protein. And that facsimile of a spike protein kicks our immune system in so that if we ever get hit by the real virus, boom, it knows how to take it on. Now, this is something that bacteria have been doing for 1 billion years. And they're not that much smarter than we are, so it's good that we learn from them how to do this. Because what bacteria do is in their own DNA, they keep a mugshot of every virus that attacked them. They have clustered repeated sequences known as CRISPRs that store a little bit of the genetic code of every virus that has hit them. And then when the virus comes back, they take a scissors, an enzyme, and the RNA directs it to cut up the genetic code of the attacking virus. In other words, it's just an adaptive immune system, exactly what we need in this day and age. And so by studying basic science, and Jennifer Doudna, my hero, she's somebody who helped figure out the structure of RNA, how RNA works. Just by studying basic science, we've been able to get these vaccines and a whole lot of other tools that CRISPR will give us, both to edit our genes, to make us immune to viruses, to detect viruses, and to kill viruses directly without us even having to take vaccines. So we're entering a whole new era of biotech just in time for this pandemic to be beaten.
And just to underscore this point, for those who may not be familiar, so in the past, vaccines were often drawn from the actual infecting agent to some degree. We're not being, with these two vaccines, we're not being actually shot up with a portion of COVID-19, correct? This is totally
correct.
different.
And even the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which uses a different formula, they're not doing it the old-fashioned way, which is you take the virus you're trying to defeat and you deactivate it or you weaken it. And that's what we do with the polio vaccine and the mumps and the measles vaccine. That goes all the way back to Edward Jenner, who took cowpox and made it as a way to inoculate people against smallpox. That's gone now. Those take a long time to make, sometimes 6 or 7 years. Secondly, they're not always totally safe because you're putting the real virus into people. These can be reprogrammed as the coronavirus mutates and creates variants. You just reprogram the RNA. So it says, okay, now I'm going to take that mutated spike protein and get at it. And so this not only will help defeat this wave of coronavirus, but it will turn the tide in our, hundreds of thousands of years we've been fighting viruses. It'll swing the power back to us humans.
This came together not just because of this dramatic breakthrough in CRISPR technology and in understanding the role that RNA plays in the process that you just described, but also because the global scientific community that had been working on this kind of biochemistry came together. Take us behind the scenes, as you reported on in the book over the course of the last year, and what that collaboration to get us to this point has been like.
Well, the notion that we could make use of RNA to do what it does as its basic function in biology, which is act as a messenger and take a little bit of a blueprint and tell the manufacturing region of a cell, build this protein. That's about 15 years of work, making it so that it could work in humans. It actually goes all the way back to a Chicago guy, the famous and sometimes infamous James Watson, and Francis Crick. After they discover the structure of DNA, they start looking at what Crick calls the central dogma of biology, which is whatever's in the DNA gets transcribed into a messenger RNA to build a protein. So they start looking at that. They figure out what this messenger RNA is. Now, Jennifer Doudna, the heroine of my book, one of the things she does after reading the double helix as a very young graduate student is that she's able to figure out the structure of an RNA that can replicate itself. So she's doing for RNA a little bit what Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin did for DNA. And so this process over the past 20 years or so of realizing RNA is this super, super molecule that's led us to the gene editing tool. It's led us to these vaccines, and it's led us to ways to fight viruses, but also cancers. And Jennifer Doudna, for example, yes, how this started this past year. It was exactly a year ago when you're shutting down things here. The WHO is declaring a pandemic, and her kid, her 17-year-old boy, Andy, was at a FIRST robotics competition in Fresno. And she woke up at 2 a.m, woke her husband up, said, we got to go get Andy because this pandemic is starting to spread. I don't want him to be at this convention center in Fresno. And they drove for like 3 or 4 hours and they retrieved, he's an only child, so you can imagine he was rolling his eyes and getting mad. But just as they're leaving the competition, a message goes out saying competition canceled. And that's when we all started exactly a year ago, kicking in. So Jennifer Doudna the next day gathered 50 scientists from the Bay Area, from Berkeley and UCSF and Stanford, and said, okay, we're going to turn our attention of all these biotech tools we've been making. We're going to divide up into teams and we're going to take on the coronavirus. And the same thing happened in Boston with her rival, Feng Zhang, and the Broad Institute had been her rival for patents and prizes and everything else. But they too said, all right, now we're turning our attention to the coronavirus. And they all become heroes of this great story. I know this has been a horrible year of the pandemic, but it's ending in the next couple of months with an absolute triumph of biology.
I want to talk more about Jennifer Doudna and the implications, both positively and negatively as we usher in this whole new wave of innovation, what you've called really the third great scientific revolution of our modern times. But before we do, I want to come back to this point around collaboration. And you mentioned this competition, which was intense on its face, litigious at times, and deeply felt by many of the participants who were working with the same kind of understanding to lead to this breakthrough. So is this a story of competition? Is it a story of collaboration? How do you see the scientific process as it comes to developing CRISPR and where we are now in this third revolution?
Really, there's no better place than Chicago to understand that competition and cooperation often go hand in hand. Whether you're a business person, whether you're a civic leader, whatever, you sometimes compete to race to win prizes, to race to win patents, to commercialize things. And that's what Jennifer Doudna did. She's a very competitive person. And I mean that as a highest compliment, because competition spurs us. It spurred Jennifer Doudna and her research partner, Emmanuel Charpentier, to work 24 hours a day, literally, because Emmanuel was in Europe, Jennifer was in California, and they'd hand off at the end of the day. It'd be the beginning of the next day in the other continent. And they just worked around the clock 7 days a week so they could win the race to figure out how CRISPR could become a tool to edit human genes. And so that competition becomes a rivalry with the people, especially at the Broad Institute, and they are still fighting over patents. But you can also collaborate, and as Jennifer did, with many, many scientists in order for her team to win. And secondly, you can even collaborate or cooperate, at least, with the people who are your competitors. I mean, you know, there's so many great books, including Jim Watson's The Double Helix, in which he and Francis Crick are competing against Linus Pauling in the United States, Maurice Wilkins and Rosalind Franklin in London, to get the DNA structure. And so whether you're a sports fanatic or a businessman or a business person, you understand that you can be a great competitor, but also know how to cooperate when it's important.
The competition, not to dwell on it too much, but for those of us who aren't directly involved in scientific research, involves everything from the kind of round-the-clock sharing of work you're talking about between collaborators to rushing to get your paper published days before your competitor who has a paper.
I mean, that was something I discovered doing it, how important it is to publish and to publish first. And Science Magazine, which just about an hour ago, I started looking at, came out with a big thing on this book. They were the publication that in 2012 published the Doudna-Charpentier paper that ends up winning the Nobel Prize. But it was when Jennifer heard the footsteps of the other teams racing to beat her, she was hammering the editors of Science Magazine and the peer reviewers, the other scientists who were reviewing the paper, get it in, get it in. But the good thing is, it's like having an alien invader from, some other planet, and all of a sudden Russia, China, and the US are cooperating because we're facing an outside threat. When that alien threat turned out to be a virus, both Jennifer Doudna and her crew and Feng Zhang at Harvard, MIT, Broad, that crew started publishing on open source servers, making it totally available to the public instantly, and also saying, we're not trying to assert any intellectual property here when it comes to fighting COVID. Whatever we've just posted, use it any way you can without worrying about the patents to fight COVID. So I think this coronavirus pandemic helped remind the scientists that, they want the prizes, they want the patents, but also they're part of a noble endeavor and they're there for a larger purpose, helping humanity.
Let's talk a bit more about Jennifer Doudna, born and raised in Hawaii. Of all the many people who are part of this story, and we should mention, while she's featured on the cover, she's in the subtitle, she is the hero of your book, front and center. You do spend lots of time talking with, reporting on, and profiling the many, many other scientists who've been involved in various aspects of this work over time. But what was it that drew you to her as the focal point of the story?
Yeah, there's a colorful cast of characters, and I hope they all come across well in the book. But Jennifer Doudna was a great central character and narrative thread. It begins, as you say, when she's a little girl in Hawaii, puzzling over nature, like why the sleeping grass curls when you touch it, or why seashells have spirals the way they do, something Leonardo da Vinci wondered about too. So I love that basic curiosity. And when she reads The Double Helix, she says, oh, and she looks at Rosalind Franklin in the book, says, I didn't realize women could become scientists. And she decides to become one. And her school counselor says, no, girls don't become scientists. But that pushes her on. So that you already can tell she's going to be a persistent and good central character. When she gets to Yale as a graduate student and then Harvard studying under Jack Szostak, she makes the discoveries about the structure of RNA, as I said earlier, which a little bit mirror the structure of DNA discoveries made by Watson Crick and Rosalind Franklin. And so she discovers how RNA is so much more interesting of a molecule. In fact, the fact that it can replicate itself means that it was the beginning of life on this planet. The big questions like that. So she's asking the big question. So she goes on to understand RNA and then figure out how it works in this CRISPR system of bacteria and how we can reprogram it so it can work in our body to cut our DNA at a pre-selected spot. Then she goes on to study different ways this RNA will work, and we see it's working in the vaccines. And finally, she decides to throw herself into public policy, the ethical issues you alluded to earlier. And so she's been the leader in this global, conferences and summits of scientists and religious leaders and policymakers on when do we use this technology and when do we try to keep this genie in the bottle. So everything about her, from her personality to the fact that she touches every aspect of the story, makes it a journey of discovery. I feel like I went on, step by step with her, from being a young girl to being a Nobel Prize winner, trying to figure out the rules of the road. And so I like writing narrative journeys of discovery rather than textbooks. And she's like Ulysses, the perfect central character for this journey. Or maybe I should say Huck Finn.
I, just for everybody who's with us tonight, want to invite you to pose your questions as well. As is customary at Chicago Humanities Festival events, we'll be sure to take questions from our audience tonight. We'll do that here in just a bit, and you can put your questions in on the YouTube chat section, just on your screen there. So don't be shy about sharing your questions, and we'll get to them in just a bit. Let's talk a bit more about the ethical questions that arise with this technology. And as we transition to it, I think a nice way to set this up is to come to this question of the third great revolution of our time as a way to frame just how significant it is for all aspects of life. Why do you call this the third great revolution of the modern era?
We've had three innovation revolutions, each based on sort of a fundamental particle of our existence. The first was the physics revolution in the first half of the 20th century, based on the atom, that fundamental particle, and a lot on Einstein's papers. And from that, you get everything from the atom bomb to space travel to GPS to semiconductors. And, we had to figure out the ethics and moral uses there. And frankly, we used the atom bomb. Right afterwards, Einstein is saying, okay, now let's think this again about the use of atomic weaponry. Second half of the 20th century was an information technology revolution, a digital revolution, based on another fundamental kernel, which is the bit, a binary digit, 0 or 1, that can encode all information. Every picture, every music, every word, every number, whatever can be encoded in bits. And we have computers, the internet, and the microchip that can process and transmit these bits. Once again, it was a revolution of great technology, but as we're seeing quite often these days, we haven't thought through all the ethical implications, like, do you take responsibility for what goes on a Facebook or a Twitter? those type of things. The third great revolution is the one I want to write about now, because I've written about the other two with Einstein and Steve Jobs and Ada Lovelace. So I'm doing this one, and it's based on the third kernel, that I call a fundamental kernel, which is the gene, and that too can be recoded. Molecules become the new microchips. We can recode the genes in our bodies and in our molecules to do things. And to me, that's going to be the most consequential of the three revolutions, because not only are we going to, hack computers and code social networks, we're going to be able to hack our own evolution and rewrite the code of our own lives.
That obviously raises so many significant ethical questions about when, how, whether, and under what circumstances genetic editing should be allowed and permitted. On the positive side, you point to a number of applications that are already being actively explored and are within grasp if they haven't been actually demonstrated yet. What are some of those on the positive side, in addition, obviously, to the COVID vaccine?
Well, this past year, Victoria Gray, a woman in Mississippi, became the first person to have her genes edited and to be cured of sickle cell, a debilitating, crushing disease. And it's a simple mutation that causes the cells to get all crumpled up like a sickle. And her stem cells from her blood were taken out, edited by CRISPR. She no longer has sickle cell. And eventually you could cure it in a hereditary way so that you could make it so that we could eliminate sickle cell from the species. There are other single gene mutations that I think, in my personal ethical opinion, there's just no argument. Let's get rid of them. Huntington's disease, cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, Tay-Sachs, sickle cell. And those already, as I say, a couple of them have been done in real patients. Also, blindness is a congenital blindness that's actually in trials now and has been done on patients, CRISPR editing the cells of the eye to get rid of this. And finally, CRISPR is being used to fight cancer, both in immunotherapy programs and other ways of doing it. You can program CRISPR to make sure our immune system knows how to kill our cancer cells. So those are beyond question in my mind. The upside, and by the way, it's not just a small upside, this is enormous. If we can cure cancers and hereditary diseases, that's, we haven't seen a leap like that since penicillin or vaccinations were invented.
You've also suggested that we're very close to technology that we could purchase at our local Walgreens or CVS that would help us administer at-home tests for genetic susceptibility. What's happening there?
And that would bring biology into our homes the way the personal computer brought microchips into our homes. And we became kind of interested in the digital revolution when you can actually have a computer in your home. I think that in the next 6-7 months, these devices have already been approved. They just now have to, be manufactured by companies and get FDA authorization to be sold. But you'll be able to just put some saliva into a little cartridge in a home testing device and instantly know whether you have the coronavirus, for example. Not these things we have to swab your nose and it gets sent to a lab and goes through a PCR cycling. So that'll be good. But the thing is, with these things that, genetic coded, so you can test for anything. You can say, do I have strep throat? Does my kid have the flu? Is it a bacterial infection I have? What about my cancers? I've sequenced the tumors. I want to know if any of the cancer cells are coming on. And we will probably, as a matter of routine, just like we occasionally take our temperature when we feel sick, or for that matter, as we brush our teeth every morning, we might do things, just sort of test to see what can be detected in our body. And that not only will improve our health enormously and stop pandemics, because you could connect these things to a network and it can map the spread of any bacteria or virus that may be spreading. But not only will it do that, it will have we'll have a personal connection to the biotech revolution.
I can imagine that there may be lots of instances like coronavirus where we would want to know the answer to the question of do we have it or not, but do we want to know everything?
Well, I think that you're certainly not compelled to know everything. You're not compelled to go to a doctor and have the battery of tests you have every year or so. I go get, my checkup every year. I get my blood tested. I get my cholesterol tested. You know, I don't get my gut microbiome tested, but the kits will do that and tell me to eat a better brand of yogurt or something. So yeah, there'll be people who are anti-science at all times. I think 90% of the people say, all right, I want to do not my annual checkup, but my weekly checkup.
Yeah, we should mention, by the way, for those who have yet to read the book, yogurt does play
Big role, big role.
a big role in this story too.
You always have practical applications, and I love basic science, but the way basic science and business, practical business application, because the most important thing, bacteria, when they're fighting off viruses, when it comes to business, is that multi-billion-dollar yogurt and cheese, starter culture industry. It's always getting hit by viruses. So Danisco had two scientists who are friends with Jennifer Doudna now, and they're helping figure out this whole technology too.
It's remarkable. So you talked about some of the benefits. Where do things start to get into a gray area for you and for other scientists and ethicists?
There are two lines. There are two lines that I think we could cross that we should do cautiously and could bring us into territory that is a slippery slope, and all slopes are slippery. But in this case, we should go step by step, hand in hand, because that'll make it safer. The first line is, I think anybody would say we want to use gene editing technology or anything else to fight bad diseases like sickle cell and the others we talked about. But if you do a gene edit to make sure our blood cells aren't sickled, it's not that much harder to also do a edit to say our blood will carry more oxygen. So you can enhance your kids so they can be much better athletes. They would have the gene so that they could have much more endurance because their blood would be much stronger. Likewise, it's not that hard to enhance muscle growth. There's a myostatin regulator, which means it stops muscle growth at a certain point. You can tweak that. So your kids or, the athletes on your team, whatever, could have much bigger muscle mass. It's already been done with cattle. It's been done with mice. It wouldn't be that hard to do. And to me, that's a blurry line between fixing genetic disabilities on one side of the line and enhancing human capabilities, which is on the other side. And you might say, well, that we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't be enhancing people. We should just be making sure they're not sick. But then you pause and you can say, well, why not? I mean, George Church, the Harvard geneticist, said to me, wait a minute, tell me what's wrong with making somebody who has better endurance and more muscles and is a little bit taller. Tell me why that's a moral problem. So we have to think it through. I can think of reasons it might be. One would be we don't want rich people to be buying better genes for their kids and having, as in Brave New World, a subspecies or something. But we have to think it through and not have knee-jerk reactions and say, and in fact, as Jennifer Doudna said, at a certain point, instead of saying it would be morally wrong to edit out something in our species, she said, well, maybe we'll be thinking a few years from now, it would be morally wrong not to do that. So let's keep our minds open, even when it comes to enhancement. The other big line that's difficult to cross, I think, is when you do sickle cell anemia in Victoria Gray down in Mississippi. She's a living patient who gave her consent. But there's a kid in my book, David Sanchez, who has sickle cell, 17 years old, and they say, we can help fix this, and we can make it edits in a certain way to reproductive cells, so your children will never, and their descendants will never have sickle cell. In other words, inheritable genetic edits. And he's only 17. He said, well, that's cool. And then he said, but maybe it should be up to the kid. they said, what do you mean? You want your kid to have sickle cell? I said, no, not really. But sickle cell taught me a lot. It taught me patience. It taught me compassion and persistence. It helped forge me, and to be a tougher person. And so that notion of editing what's called the germline, meaning it's inheritable, that's another line we should say, let's pause. Doesn't mean we shouldn't cross it. It just means, okay, that takes us into ethically different territory when you're not just editing one person, but editing the human species.
As a student of history, as a student of genius and a biographer, you have made reference also to the way in which conditions, physical, mental, actually shape us in profound ways. They create untold suffering, and yet they also produce moments of absolute human transcendence.
Yeah, I mean, Franklin Roosevelt, totally forged by having had polio. However, I don't know anybody who says, I think I'm not going to give my kid a polio vaccine because I'm hoping he'll be Franklin Roosevelt. So these are tough ethical questions. Yeah, we get forged by the challenges we face. The deaf community says, well, why do we think hearing enabled is, the only way? Our society is more diverse and better with people who are deaf. So we have to all figure that out. If it were up to me, I would, and I knew that my child might be deaf, I would want to, fix that, I guess is a simple phrase for it. But other people would say, no, you shouldn't. You should take whatever natural endowment and allotment you got. But, there are a lot of people who've been arguing this for the past 30 years, even before gene editing. Leon Kass in Chicago, who's a great biologist. Everybody knows him as a philosopher and public policy thinker at the University of Chicago. But in 1970s, he was writing about genetic engineering and how far we should go. Likewise, Jennifer Doudna, many other people. So in the book, he's in the book, but so are dozens of other people, as I try to say, right, let's think this through. And by the way, let's open our minds for a second and not have a knee-jerk reaction.
So just to play that up for 1 second, what then is wrong necessarily? And why did the scientific community, the global community, and indeed ultimately the Chinese government and justice system react so harshly to news that the Chinese scientists several years ago who had genetically modified the embryos of two twins to prevent them from contracting HIV? Why was that considered a red line? What was it?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question because that's a key point in the book, which is, we talk about this as some futuristic technology. No, 2.5 years ago, a Chinese scientist made inheritable edits in twin girls who are alive and did it so that they would not have the receptor that, gets HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. And the reason there was a lot of shock and awe and upset in the scientific community is, first of all, it was definitely premature. It's not safe. It hadn't, we hadn't looked yet at the possible off-target, edits that could happen, the unintended consequences. That receptor may or may not help you prevent getting malaria, for example. But also, it was sloppily done. He didn't get every cell in the body. But leave that aside, because a better doctor in a few years could do that procedure and make it work well and make it safe. So it was something beyond the fact that he just did it in a sloppy, way that was premature. It was that question of crossing that line and making an inheritable edit when there are probably other ways to prevent getting AIDS. Do you really want to change the human species willy-nilly that way? Now, then everybody's saying, no, let's not do it. I suspect people's minds have been changed slightly by this pandemic, which is, all right, let's think this through again. If we could edit out some of the receptors that allow us to get dangerous viruses, why would we not do so? So I keep urging people, this book is not filled with answers. It's filled with, let me open your mind a bit, and then let's all think through this together.
While the scientists were talking about, went quote unquote rogue as it relates to both the scientific process and the established ethical guidelines that were still in the process of being settled. He himself was a member of the scientific community. He wasn't some, nefarious actor who was working off book, as it were. And this technology, as you and others have pointed out, is actually remarkably easy to implement. I think somebody has said, that essentially you could acquire the essential materials and tools with a few $1,000s on eBay and some know-how. You yourself, I think, were in a lab where you had the chance to, as you recount in the book, do some editing. So the question, I guess, becomes, and I'm certainly happy to have you speak to your own experiences with this, but how do we prevent bad actors? How do we prevent state actors? How do we prevent sci-fi kinds of scenarios? People who are trying to legitimately gain an advantage and do so perhaps outside of the norms that the scientific and ethical community might establish.
Well, yeah, and it's not like atom bombs where you can't really do it that easily in your basement or your garage.
Right.
As you said, I went to Jennifer's lab, and within 2 days, I had edited human genes using CRISPR. Now, we flushed it down the drain with chlorine so it didn't, become part of this planet. But it does show it's easy enough to be done. What's difficult, but not impossible, is delivering those edits. Once you've edited the genes, you have to either get it into early stage embryos or into cells of the body. But, a graduate student can do that pretty easily as well. So you're right. This is going to be a little bit harder to control. It's going to be hard to keep a genie in the bottle when anybody can open the bottle who has a lab at a college biology department. So we'll have to say, here's where we don't want to go. We don't want to do these things. And if we get a general consensus, and I think the Chinese, the Europeans, the British, and the Americans are actually working together on this thing, you can have FDA and, state regulatory agencies say this shouldn't be done. Then you ask about the rogue actor. Well, one thing we have is the Defense Department is spending lots of money, including in Jennifer's lab. They've given her grants to create what's called anti-CRISPR, which is a little bit what it sounds like, which is how do you reverse it? Like if a rogue or bad player does something, not so much just editing a human being, but like editing mosquitoes to make them pathogenic. How do you do anti-CRISPR? Another thing is if you have regulations and societal shame and you like breaking in line to get a vaccine, you have rules. I'm sure there are people in Chicago who broke in line and got the vaccine. But so, it's nice to know that I think 99% of the people played by the rules. And that's true of everything from shoplifting to trading an elephant tusk. You can probably break the rules if you want, but we just need to get 99% of the people to play by the rules. I think we could do that if we had a general consensus of let's do this, but let's not do that when it comes to gene editing.
We have some superb questions coming in from those of us who are with us tonight. Let me go with this one as a starter, because it relates. As a bioethicist, one concern I have is that the cost of this technology, privatization, likely means it will increase inequity. What's your sense of this, having studied that? That
is, I would say, my biggest worry too. If these things aren't free, and they won't be, then people go to the genetic supermarket shopping for their kids' genes or their own, and the rich will buy better genes for their kids. We already have inequality in our society, but that would exacerbate it. And not only exacerbate it, it would encode it so that as part of our species, like in Brave New World or in the movie Gattaca, we have those who are genetically enhanced and those who aren't. And that would be a horrible scenario. Now, one of the things Jennifer Doudna's lab is doing is trying to make it so it's more equitable, less expensive, especially on sickle cell, let's say. a disease that affects, often the Black community and people who have been underserved by the medical community and historically. So they're looking for ways that you don't have to do the stem cells, so we can make it less expensive. But I think we can also say we're not going to approve genetic technologies that would widen the inequality gap. That when we decide we're going to say, yes, we can do this sickle cell, we can do this, part of the thing we look at is, can it be available equitably, and will it help everybody in society, or will it further exacerbate the divide we have between the privileged and not? And that could be part of our calculation, I think.
A related question is relates to the long-term consequences of CRISPR. How do we know that there aren't negative clinical outcomes from this gene editing?
Well, that's why the Chinese doctors' experiment was so worrisome, is we haven't assured the safety of taking out that CCR5 gene, which is the gene that produces a receptor for HIV in our cells. And yeah, there can be long-term consequences of it. I think researchers are pretty good at saying that's the big issue. Let's test it in many ways. One way to do it is, and this is what I would do for the next decade or two at least, is say you can make edits, to fix things, but the edits you make have to create cells or a genome that is typical, that we already have in our species. In other words, you can't put in some gene, or you can't make an edit that the species hasn't had before. You can do something like take out the mutation for sickle cell and thus create a genome that's typical of 98% or more of the planet. And so if you're doing something that creates a outcome that already exists in the wild, so to speak, then I think you're safer. But it's true of any medical procedure. I mean, when Fleming, or when, Edward Jenner, let's say, first put cowpox in this arm of this gardener's son, there could be unintended consequences. So that's what FDA approvals and we do to make sure it doesn't happen. But I think if you stick with creating genetic makeups that already exist in most people, and you're just fixing the ones that are abnormal, then there's probably a pretty good safety there.
There are a few questions about other potential benefits. One relates to the possibilities of CRISPR technology for helping human beings adapt to climate change, which I'd love your thoughts on. And the other relates to other medical conditions showing the most promise beyond the ones we've talked about. For example, conditions like hemophilia.
Right.
What does the science tell us about those two things?
Well, first of all, in climate change, there's a lot CRISPR is already doing, not so much in human edits, but you can edit, in agriculture, wheat and corn, and for that matter, livestock, to be more resilient given climate change, more resilient to droughts, more resilient to floods, whatever it may be. And that will be a boon in at least helping us feed the planet as climate change exists. Another thing which I'm a little bit wary of, and also not an expert in, so I don't want to pontificate, is you can create organisms that are, say, carbon capture organisms, in the sea or whatever. And there are ways to increase nature's natural ability to do carbon capture. But as I say, I'm not an expert there. I do know, and Bill Gates has been working on it, you can use CRISPR to create types of organisms that might help there. But I think you have to have Bill Gates come explain that one to you, because it's not in my field of expertise. As for other diseases, I think ones that are clearly genetically caused, and preferably with a simple genetic issue, are the ones that can be fixed. And that, of course, does include hemophilia. A little bit more complex than sickle cell, but yes. Now, there are things that are not just genetic, including cancer, but even, I don't know, IQ, that's probably the most complicated of all, but it's probably partly genetic and partly environmental and partly chance and partly who knows what. So that's at one, things like intelligence are at one far extreme, which is it'll be decades before we can fiddle with that safely genetically. And at the other extreme are things that have single or close to single gene abnormalities. And hemophilia is clearly simply a genetic disease. It's not something that you learn to get or get environmentally or something. It's because you have a genetic defect, I guess you could say.
In speaking to the potential around climate change, you made reference to what's already taking place when it comes to agriculture and crops. Obviously, the whole topic of genetically modified crops and food has been a controversial one over the last decade plus. Mm-hmm. What does your reporting and research into that topic tell you about how we should think about GMO foods in the context of genetic editing?
Yeah. I'm going to be a little bit controversial here, but I think it's fine that people oppose GMOs or that they're against GMOs. But it would be helpful if some of those people knew what a genetically modified organism actually is and how you do it and what the yogurt scientists found and what happens when you eat yogurt and everything else. I think GMOs, when it comes to food, be it the golden corn and the agricultural revolution, has been one of the great boons to this planet. And that sometimes we have a adverse reaction to anything that sounds slightly scientific, and I think that's bad. I think it's very good to understand what the golden rice, I should say, but corn also, what those things are. And by the way, that every single organism on this planet has been genetically modified over the course of time. So I think I push back. Obviously, we don't want to overdo it with GMOs. We don't want to overdo it with fertilizers. We don't want to overdo it with chemicals, whatever. But I think a knee-jerk reaction against all genetic engineering of grains is probably a bad idea. Of course, there are lots of agribusinesses that have given GMOs a bad name, and that's on them. But I've gone far enough to be controversial to say, hey, before you have a strong opinion on GMOs, it'd be good to know what is modified in the organism and why. I do think that anti-GMO sentiment, which is particularly strong in Europe, will affect the question of CRISPR. Because if you don't like GMOs in rice, you're truly not going to like genetic engineering or genetic editing in humans. But once I hear people talking about that, and sometimes even in chat rooms of meetings like this, or later people will call me or email me and say, yes, but my daughter has cystic fibrosis, or got this rare genetic disease where her lungs are collapsing, or his muscles are atrophying. What can you do? Can I get in touch with Jennifer Doudna? Let me show you a picture of my little boy. And that's when you say, okay, we want to be open to what science can do, as well as be cautious about going too far modifying nature.
Another question from somebody who's with us tonight is as follows. What will have the greater impact on human evolution in your view, CRISPR or the integration of humans and machines?
I think it'll all come together after a while, which is computational biology and data mining will sort of intersect with genetic engineering and coding, and people like Cameron Mirvold and many other people are at that intersection. I wouldn't have written this book if I weren't biased towards thinking that the life sciences revolution will have more lasting impact then, I mean, I look at artificial intelligence and look at I'll call it augmented intelligence, the symbiosis between humans and machines. And I think that's truly amazing, and some great things are going to happen. But to me, the biotech revolution is going to be bigger.
Here's a question
By
from
the
a
way,
high
I should
school
modify
biology.
that. But I should modify that. It will be bigger in the next 20 years. I think that at some point, AI, like 40, 50 years from now, when you have general artificial intelligence, that goes beyond my ability to predict the impact of that one.
That's your next book, right?
Yeah.
We have a question from a high school biology teacher. What do you think is the most important lesson for students to take away about gene editing and its future impact on all of humanity?
I think the most important lesson, especially for a biology teacher, is that nature is beautiful, and basic science and basic curiosity lead to unexpected things. When you're playing with bacteria and you discover something and you're doing it out of curiosity, you're not knowing that it could lead to a tool to edit genes and a tool to stop coronavirus. And almost all great scientific advances sort of come from people who are just curious, and also curious across disciplines. I mean, this is the Chicago Humanities Festival. And I always like to say that the most creative of people are those who have a foot in the sciences and a foot in the humanities, like Jennifer Doudna. I think it's dangerous for scientists not to have a feel for the humanities, and I frankly think it's dangerous for humanists not to have a feel for science. But if I were a biology teacher, I would teach it in the context of human history, human evolution, human aspiration. So when you're talking about gene editing, it's not just an engineering issue of coding the right letters of genetic code. It's also an issue for the humanities of what is the purpose of life? Why are we given a natural allotment of endowments? And what happens when we decide we want to mess with the natural lottery that gives us our endowments? Those are interrelated questions of the humanities and the sciences.
I want to pull the lens back. You talked about the idea of discovery and the embrace of science and the humanities. There's a question here from an audience member, and I'd love to build off of that, asking, what does Dr. Doudna have in common with the subjects of the other biographies of Leonardo da Vinci, Albert Einstein, Steve Jobs, Benjamin Franklin, etc.?
Well, I've alluded to some of it, which is that basic curiosity. The curiosity, you and I had, Stephen, when we were in our wonder years, and why is the sky blue? And then eventually enough grown-ups say, quit asking so many dumb questions, and we see the blue sky. I can, see it with the sunset now. But, we quit asking, why is the sky blue? Why is the sunset pink? Whatever. That's in Leonardo's notebook. Why is the sky blue? It's also in Einstein's notebook. Why is the sky blue? Jennifer Doudna. And these are people who don't outgrow their wonder years. They're still asking those basic questions. And secondly, everybody, especially Leonardo, Ben Franklin, Einstein, Steve Jobs, Jennifer Doudna, all of them, they have, as I said, not only a foot in the humanities and a foot in the sciences, but they're interested in all subjects, whether it's Franklin or Leonardo. They're interested in art and anatomy and zoology and music and math. And then you see patterns that ripple across nature. That's what Steve Jobs could do. That's what Jennifer Doudna can do.
It's remarkable. I'm curious to know, just in your work chronicling these figures, are there insights or habits, perhaps personal habits, or approaches to life that you discovered in writing about them that you have adapted or adopted for your own life?
Yeah, I mean, I think a certain persistence and focus is very good, and the ability to tune things out for a while. I mean, Steve Jobs, and when I write, I now try to do that. But I also, even though I tune things out, I try to look at the broad picture. I try to, and I try not to be intimidated by any subject. I mean, I think one of the things as kids, you feel I can learn anything. And then at a certain point, you say, I can't do math, or I can't do, I don't do science. Well, nobody should say, I don't do science. I mean, that's like saying, I don't do literature or something. I don't appreciate art. We'd think you're a Philistine if you
Or I
said
don't do
that.
life or something. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think, most of the people I've written about, and Ben Franklin and Leonardo are probably the two exemplars. It was like, all right, they tried to appreciate everything that they could about everything that was knowable in their time, whether it was looking for the Gulf Stream or looking at fossils or painting or music or whatever. And sometimes we get tunnel vision and we think, oh, that's, whatever. That's computers. I don't understand computers. Or that's art. I don't understand art. Don't do that to yourself. You can learn anything.
We have just a couple of minutes before we wrap. Just to build on that for you, you've had a career not only as a writer of these acclaimed books, but as somebody who has led CNN, one of the largest, most influential media companies. You've led the Aspen Institute, a huge consequential think tank of sorts. Now you're teaching history at Tulane as a professor of history. What spurred you in that direction, and how have you thought about your own career pursuits in the context of curiosity and discovery?
Well, a couple things. Chicago is a great city, and I'm sure, people in Chicago always come home. New Orleans isn't quite as great of a city, but I think at a certain point in life, it's good to come home and get involved in local things, get involved in the city planning commission I joined, whatever. I think in a time of poisonous politics, the way to get out of our poison politics is to think locally and act locally and be civic. There's no better city in America for civic interaction and civic working together than Chicago. I'd love to instill some of the genetic code of that into New Orleans. So I wanted to come home. Secondly, I love to teach and I love young students. I mean, I taught my course today. I teach a course in the digital revolution. I mean, man, the kids are just absolutely fascinated by everything and their minds are open. They haven't yet been turned and polarized or whatever. And so there's a joy that comes from teaching. And, I spent some time in New York, a little time in Chicago, and obviously time here in New Orleans, and juggle a few things, writing my books, serving on nonprofit or other boards. But the main thing I like to do is go to Tulane and sit around with the students and learn from them as much as they're going to learn from me.
Well, Walter Isaacson, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
teaching us tonight. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you, and thanks for all of your work over the years.
Well, thank you.
It's
It was really
extraordinary.
great, Steve. And Steve, thanks for the Chicago Humanity Festival and all of the people there do.